2,000 years ago, give or take a century, the Greek city of Tarentum in southern Italy fell out with the empire of Rome. Rome had signed a treaty, you see, promising not to send its warships into the waters of Tarentum. But like all empires and great countries do, they broke their promise and installed garrisons on the western side of the Tarentine Gulf. The Tarentines responded by attacking the Romans, driving the Roman garrison from the city and sinking several of their warships. Tarentum was now faced with a Roman attack and certain annihilation, unless they could find a big, strong supporter. Their savior was King Pyrrhus of Epirus, who attacked the Romans with an army consisting of some 20,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, 2,000 archers, 500 slingers, and most important, 20 elephants. The elephants had been loaned to him by Ptolemy II, who had also promised 9,000 soldiers to replace the men he lost, and a further 50 elephants to defend Epirus while Pyrrhus and his army were away. Due to his superior cavalry, his deadly flanks of infantry, and above all his elephants, Pyrrhus routed the Romans. And then he made this very, very famous observation. If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined. Hi, and welcome to this episode of The Print Explorer. This week we'll be discussing the remarkable and potentially revolutionary technology demonstrated when Iran fired large numbers of missiles and drones at Israel last week, a technology called missile defense. As you'll have read, Israel claims it destroyed 99% of these incoming devices, missiles and drones. Now, there are other claims putting that figure at around 83% and still other accounts which are even less glossy. For example, some reports suggest that about half the missiles and drones Iran fired malfunctioned and fell to the ground, crashed on their way to Israel. There are even some accounts which suggest Iran gave deliberate advance warning of its attacks to aid interception. I don't pretend to know the truth, and I very much doubt we'll get a clear, honest picture at any time in the near future. What we do know, thanks to analysis of satellite images in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, is that 9 missiles made it through, 4 of them hitting the Nevatim base. I'm sometimes asked why I like anecdotes from ancient history so much. Well, I think they help us focus the mind. In discussing modern conflicts and wars, we're often blinded by the whiz-bang of tech and our own ideological preferences. These ancient stories sometimes help us distill the problem to its essence. And the problem has to do with the dilemma King Pyrrhus confronted so many centuries ago. What is the price we're willing to pay for victory? Like so many of our modern weapon systems, the guided missile was a product of the enormous creativity, perverse creativity if you prefer, unleashed during the Second World War as the Nazis and Allies battled for supremacy. Fritz-X, an anti-ship weapon, was the first precision-guided missile to come into use, destroying the Royal Navy's light cruiser HMS Uganda off the coast of Italy in September 1943. The engineer who designed Fritz-X, Max Kramer, ended up working in the United States on designing pilotless vehicles at the Naval Air Development Station in Johnsonville, Pennsylvania. Exactly how and why a Nazi engineer ended up in the United States had to do with a top-secret United States intelligence operation codenamed Operation Paperclip, which recruited top Nazi scientific talent. The operation was very controversial because it let some scientists responsible for horrible war crimes evade justice, but that's a story for another episode. Anyway, the Germans followed up Fritz-X with a whole series of exquisitely engineered missiles. The V1, which can be called the first cruise missile, was used operationally against London and Antwerp. The V2, which you can call the first ballistic missile, was also used against these targets. The V2 rocket, by the way, became the first artificial object to travel into space by crossing what's called the Kármán line, the edge of space, with a vertical launch on the 20th of June 1944. There was no really reliable defense against the WWII, although it was sometimes successfully challenged by Tempest fighters. There was no defense at all against the V2. The best strategy the British really brought to the table was deceit. To adjust and correct the settings of the V1, you see, the Germans needed to know where the missiles they fired were landing. Therefore, German intelligence requested their agents in Britain to obtain impact data so that the launch parameters could be adjusted. What they didn't know was that all the German agents in Britain, without exception, had been turned and were acting as double agents under British control. On the 16th of June 1994, there's British double agent Garbo, whose real name was Juan Pujol, was requested by his German controllers to give information on the sites and times of V1 impacts, and similar requests were made to other German agents in Britain, like Brutus, Roman Czerniawski, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Tate Wolf Schmidt. They all provided slightly erroneous data. Now, this was less than a perfect strategy. For example, if the Germans corroborated what the agents were giving them against the impact data from the radio sets which guided their V1s, they would have known that the impact data was far more accurate than anything the agents were offering. But this deceit succeeded to quite an extent in blinding the Germans. But even as this disinformation plan went ahead, the head of the British Anti-Aircraft Defence Command, General Frederick Alfred Pyle, was working to put together a technological solution. At a meeting on the 15th of January 1945, General Pyle's updated plan was presented with some strong advocacy from Roderick Hill and Charles Drummond Ellis. In essence, the committee suggested that they could draw a system of grids into which 150 specially designed anti-aircraft weapons would fire. On the 15th of January, though, the committee suggested deferring this test a little bit, as no technique for tracking the missiles with sufficient accuracy had yet been discovered. That problem was solved by March 1945, with the radar capable of detecting 81% of missiles correctly to the incoming grid, which could then be saturated by anti-aircraft missile fire. At the 26th March meeting, Pyle was directed to a subcommittee to further develop the statistics a little bit before doing the tests, and 3 days later the team returned a report stating that if the guns fired 2,000 rounds a minute at a missile within the grid, there was a 1 in 60 chance of shooting it down. Not bad. The world's first anti-ballistic missile system, though, was beaten to the draw, because by the time it was ready to test, British ground troops, Allied ground troops along with the Americans, had pretty much overrun Germany, and there were no V2s being fired anymore into the United Kingdom. Even though the problem confronting London was solved, the big question of defending a nation against incoming modern missiles wasn't. Already in the very first days after the end of the Second World War, a special operations group was established and tasked with preparing a report summarizing Allied methods for counteracting these missiles. In March 1946, the United States Air Force began working on what it called Thumper and Wizard. The latter of these was to grow onto a larger scale and brought some moderate success according to technological histories. The growing tension between the USSR and the United States in the 1950s obviously caused a lot of the acceleration of funding to these programs under President Dwight Eisenhower, which would eventually culminate in something called the Nike 2 project. Tens of thousands of attempts carried out under this program proved that it was possible to destroy a ballistic missile with another missile, but the results yet weren't very conclusive enough to accelerate further research, not conclusive enough to be a credible defense system. The culmination of these projects was something called the Nike Zeus anti-ballistic missile in 1957. It was designed to be part of an integrated defense system that would include advanced capturing and tracking radars and battlefield communication devices. The program, though, was suspended in 1961 because the results weren't quite as good as were expected, particularly because of deficiencies in the early detection of launches by the adversary. Again, though, interest would be sparked, and this time because the Soviet Union sent the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, into space. A rocket that could carry a satellite into space was obviously a rocket that could also deliver an atomic warhead on the United States, and it became a priority to develop an adequate defensive system. As an alternative to Nike Zeus, which you'll remember I just said had to, fairly finite and limited yields, a new program called Defender was proposed. It was a really advanced project for its time, and it proposed many unconventional, far-sighted solutions to possible problems. An advanced research projects agency was created whose task was to identify new means that could be used to increase defense capabilities. The Defender project went far beyond anything Nike Zeus achieved and resulted in the analysis of all phases of ballistic missile defense. Despite unconventional and original solutions, though, the program was suspended in 1968, again due to difficulties in developing technical solutions given what was then available. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 gave the United States yet another boost to develop a credible missile defense system, and this one, more improved, more robust, was called Nike X. The main change was abandoning the attempt to intercept the ballistic missile in its initial phase of flight for its destruction outside the atmosphere, in what's called the mid-course phase of flight. In 1962-63, around pretty much the same time, the Soviet Union also began constructing an anti-ballistic missile system, but with a very different approach. The Soviets envisaged firing nuclear-armed Galosh interceptor missiles at incoming warheads. Each Galosh warhead would have a yield of several megatons, several hundreds of times the size of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945, and obliterate pretty much everything in their path. There was obviously a cost to this, because if you blow up nuclear missiles at relatively low altitudes over your own territory, it will cause enormous damage, but it would be enough to protect some strategically vital installations like command and control centers from attack. Like the safeguard system in the US, though, the Soviet ABM system suffered from several limitations. The doghouse, the giant radar responsible for tracking incoming missiles, could be deceived by countermeasures. The radar could also be blinded by nuclear explosions themselves, like the detonation of the Galosh. And it could deal with only 6 to 8 incoming missiles, far too small a number given the size to which the superpower nuclear arsenals had swelled by 1962. So how did both sides solve this problem of limited defense capabilities? Well, they built more and more missiles. One, to guarantee that even if the other side's missiles got through, they could hit back. And two, to overwhelm any defenses the other side might put in place. From 1967, the Strategic Affairs Silky Core has recorded, the number of warheads in the US arsenal swelled. The US land-based Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Force in 1990 was reported to be made up of 2,450 warheads mounted on 1,000 missiles, and its submarine force of another 5,216 warheads on around 600 missiles. That's enough to annihilate our planet several times over. The superpowers, though, ended up in 1972 recognizing the futility of this approach more and more and more, and signed an anti-ballistic missile treaty. In this treaty, both sides committed themselves to the protection of just one site, with no more than 100 interceptor missiles. In 2002, however, with the Soviet Union having collapsed, the United States withdrew from the treaty to pursue a new anti-ballistic missile program. That decision spurred Russia and China to begin the development of increasingly sophisticated hypersonic missiles, which are designed to punch through these ABM defenses and to expand their own arsenals. But for our story today, it's the anti-ballistic missile part of this story that's particularly important. The attacks of September 11, 2001 were the real catalyst that led these United States efforts to build a new ballistic missile shield to kick into gear. Changing the character of the opponent caused a return to the idea of anti ballistic missile defense on the largest scale since the Reagan years in the 80s. In December 2001, the United States began its withdrawal from the ABM treaty, and basically it became concerned with intercepting missiles let loose by rogue regimes, a category in which there was a vast number of characters from states like North Korea and Iran to terrorist groups which might conceivably be able to develop some missile capabilities. Missile defense involved now putting together subsystems. You needed something for command, sensors to detect launches, a boost defense segment with spacecraft, and onshore kinetic energy interceptors, as well as airborne lasers. There was a mid course defense system targeting the phase in which a launched ballistic missile would travel through space. Um, and those would have missiles called a sea based Aegis and a ground based mid course defense missile to target that mid course stage. And finally, a terminal defense segment, that's the stage where the missile would hurtle back towards Earth, towards its targets, with mobile air defense missiles. Now, in September 2002, the United States declared a new national security strategy that explained the logic for seeking these tools. And it said that classic deterrence, which relied on assuring that you would retaliate against the other side's nuclear attack by annihilating the other country, no matter how powerful the first strike was, wouldn't work against rogue states. The leader of a rogue state, after all, might not be deterred by the prospect of annihilation because they might not, for ideological or theological reasons, see this as a problem. They might be willing to sacrifice their nation state or their territory for scoring a colossal attack at the United States, just like Osama bin Laden did on 9/11. Now, what if Osama bin Laden had ballistic missiles instead of having to send hijackers in planes? Well, he could blow up buildings, and therefore the United States thought it needed these capabilities. The financial crisis in 2008 and the rise to power of President Barack Obama caused the slowdown of work on the anti missile program, both for financial reasons and because of some reconsideration around some of these questions. Was, for example, the threat from a non state actor really serious enough to warrant this massive investment of resources? What were the implications for countries like Russia and China, which would then step up their own production of threatening warheads? But in 2013, the administration of Barack Obama admitted that its policy on missile defense was wrong. Then Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel announced that the United States would strengthen its ground-based missile defense components in Alaska and California, recognizing that the threat from North Korea had proceeded much more quickly than planners had believed it would. Former President Donald Trump, who took office in 2017, was a big missile defense enthusiast and committed himself to further investments in the program to defend against attacks from Iran and North Korea. He said that in his very inaugural speech. He didn't provide a lot of detail, but we know a lot of money was spent on developing technologies, some of which probably went into knocking down Iran's ballistic missiles, because we know US ships stationed off Israel's coast played a key role in bringing down some of those missiles. And that opens a question: how effective is the technology the world is being offered? 2 years ago, the American Physical Society, that's a body of the country's top physicists, released a 54-page study analyzing the effectiveness of existing and planned American systems for defending against one particular kind of missile, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Focusing narrowly on attacks involving the limited number of intercontinental ballistic missiles that North Korea could hypothetically launch against the continental United States, these eminent physicists suggested that, and I quote, current capabilities are low and will continue to be low for the next 15 years. What does that mean in plain English? That the US would have a problem even against an adversary with limited numbers of ICBMs, like North Korea, forget the capabilities Russia and China have on the table. The study was assembled by a group of 13 physicists and nuclear weapons experts at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign under Professor Fred Lamb. Now, why intercontinental ballistic missiles? And it's here we have to turn to the different kinds of missiles on the table. Now, one, obviously, are cruise missiles which hug terrain. And the advantage of a cruise missile which hugs the terrain is that its detection, because of the curvature of the Earth, happens fairly late. But because of atmospheric resistance, it moves comparatively slowly. An intercontinental ballistic missile or a long-range ballistic missile goes into outer space. It starts slowly, but because there is no resistance, atmospheric resistance, it moves very quickly through space and descends at enormously high speeds. And those high speeds make it quite hard to detect, especially if you can have missiles that have erratic terminal trajectories, as they approach their final target, which they can, because obviously a missile carrying a nuclear weapon doesn't have to be tremendously accurate. If you're targeting a city, for example, it doesn't really matter if your nuclear bomb lands on street A or on street B, because you're going to annihilate the entire target. Now, current and prospective US missile defense systems have been built through the 6 decades of work that I described, and is estimated to have cost over $350 billion in inflation-adjusted 2020 dollars. According to Frank von Hippel, who did those calculations, and Dr. Hippel is, by the way, a co-founder of Princeton University's program on science and global security, further increases in the last 5 years reflect an enthusiasm for ballistic missile defense in both Congress and in administration. Now, these 3 phases of flight, the rocket-powered boost phase, the unpowered mid-course through outer space, and the brief terminal phase of atmospheric re-entry, were all looked at separately by this expert group. The ground-based mid-course defense is the only system currently deployed to defend the continental United States, and they have 44 interceptors based in Alaska and California. Now, recent GMD tests have been quite successful, the study notes, though the study hasn't been tested as much as the experts would have liked. But its overall performance in tests has been somewhat uneven. The study particularly questions whether GMD could reliably overcome countermeasures that incoming missiles are likely to deploy. For example, how would you tell whether, if the other side launched 100 missiles and 10 had warheads, which 10 were carrying the nuclear missiles and which 90 were just carrying dummies meant to suck away your interceptors into attacking inconsequential targets? So there's a problem with GMD. The kill vehicles have been redesigned. There's been a lot of ongoing work on it, but questions arising. Then there's the whole question of layered defense. The United States has 2 systems, as I mentioned, Aegis and the Army's Terminal High Altitude Area Defense operating in the United States. However, it's unclear if this will ever be able to scale up to intercept targets across the entire United States. Massive investments, obviously, and technological problems involved in defending such an enormous area, the whole of Europe or the whole of United States. And the expert group says there's the planned next generation interceptor which could address some of these problems, but there are 21 of those designed. No one knows if this will in fact provide a solution to the problem of defending an area. Now, how then, if the United States itself is struggling with this problem, how did Israel succeed? Where does this 90%, 91%, 99% figure come from? And what does it mean for other countries struggling with similar problems? Well, ever since Israel in the 2000s became very adept at dealing with terrorist threats and small-scale attacks by terrorists, it came under increasing challenges because of the growing inventories of crude, short-range missiles that were amassed by Hezbollah, that's the Iranian proxy operating in southern Lebanon, or semi-proxy, and Hamas in Gaza. These rocket attacks weren't terribly lethal, much less lethal certainly than Israel's own sophisticated missile and guided weapons attacks against its adversaries, but they impose significant physical costs on the country's population. They caused damage to property, to bases, to assembly areas, and created, I think, most important, a climate of fear in parts of the country, which corroded the everyday lives of Israelis and their sense of security. So Amir Peretz, Israel's former defense minister, authorized the pursuit of what they now call the Iron Dome system in the wake of the 2006 war in Lebanon and in the face of considerable skepticism. Shlomo Toaf, the head of the Iron Dome directorate, recalled, people responded to the proposal by laughing in our faces, simply because the technical challenges seemed so overwhelming. Now, Iron Dome was not initially designed to protect civilians at all, but the Israel Defense Forces critical infrastructure. Remember what the Soviets had done? Their critical installations, they protected with nuclear interceptors. Well, Iron Dome was something like that for Israeli critical infrastructure, but meant to defend against incoming rocket, artillery, and mortar. And it proved itself very, very capable at hitting targets in a range of about 7 to 70 kilometers. Having precisely tracked an incoming target, the interceptor missile detonates within a meter of the target. The operators are able to pick and choose which incoming rockets to fire at and ignore misdirected fire, that's missiles going off in directions where they pose no credible harm. Leaders, though, rapidly realized that Iron Dome had political value. People, voters, clamored to be protected against these threats, the threat of missiles being fired by Hezbollah and Hamas, and they wanted the same protection. Increasingly, the system became focused on the defense of population centers rather than just those critical military targets. Iron Dome, the scholar Elizabeth Bartle, who studied this very, very closely, observes, was proving its worth by 2012. In the course of the 2012 Israeli military operation Pillar of Defense, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad fired more than 1,456 rockets into Israel. That's an average of about 215 rounds per day. Iron Dome, even then, this is 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, was able to intercept as many as 85% of the rockets it targeted, and the rockets were able to cause just 6 civilian deaths, 6, compared to 44 casualties inflicted by these weapons in 2006. Later in 2014, Hamas fired a total of about 4,500 rockets and mortars from July 8 to August 26. The interception rate went up to 90%. Only 2 individuals were killed. Fantastic, right? End of story? Not quite. For a number of reasons, though, Iron Dome is technological magic, but not quite what is marketed. First, the rockets that groups like Hamas fire from Gaza or Hezbollah from Lebanon are extremely cheap, maybe a few $100s to put together. But Iron Dome's interceptor missiles are estimated to cost anywhere between $100,000 and $250,000 each. Hamas and Islamic Jihad use DIY technology. Their rockets mostly are pretty much simple steel piping with crude fins to stabilize their trajectory, and they use a combination of fertilizer and sugar as rocket fuel and locally made explosive in the warhead. Iron Dome inexorably imposes a severely asymmetric cost on the defender. And that's one of the objectives of all insurgents, including Hamas and Hezbollah. After all, if you force me to spend $1,000 compared to the $100 that an insurgent is using, you're imposing asymmetrical costs not just on my military, but on my economy, my resources, and my defense industrial production base. The low cost of the Gaza rockets also means it's possible for attackers to try and overwhelm Iron Dome with multiple simultaneous attacks, which is exactly what we saw in the first days of the Gaza war with some success. The level at which Iron Dome can be overwhelmed is a tightly held secret. But anyone will be able to tell you that at some level of incoming attacks, any system will be overwhelmed. Some independent experts estimate that Iron Dome can handle some 1500 simultaneous incoming attacks. To prevent that level from being reached, Israel will have to launch strikes against missile batteries in Gaza using its combat jets or its own missiles to make sure more than 1500 can't be launched at any one time. But that causes heavy civilian casualties, which put Israel in the diplomatic doghouse, in addition to breeding another generation of angry, alienated Palestinians who are attracted to terrorist groups. Thus, you end up back in the same dead end that Iron Dome was intended to avoid in the first place. Even though Iron Dome has done very well against Hamas's limited technology, Bartels notes, it may prove less effective against more sophisticated adversaries. From relatively simple achievements like flattening the trajectory of their missiles so that detection becomes slower, to newer tools like drones, which can maybe evade radar or confuse it, Iron Dome may not always prove successful. In a thoughtful analysis, Lazar Berman, an Israeli scholar, noted that the illusion of ironclad defense creates another problem. It led the Israel Defense Forces and political decision makers to think they didn't have to address the simmering problems which had created national security threats for them in the first place. I quote, "As the Prime Minister and others declare victory time and time again in front of Iron Dome batteries, Hamas and Islamic Jihad's capabilities continue to grow," Berman argues. As important, there's little appetite within the political leadership for the grinding ground operations that are necessary for the IDF to genuinely undermine Hamas. Thus, we're seeing in the last few days, Israel has actually withdrawn ground forces in Khan Yunis because this long war of attrition, while imposing costs on Israel and killing civilians in epic numbers in Gaza, wasn't actually finishing off Hamas. Even more important, the idea that Israeli civilians can survive attack under Iron Dome's protection has led Israeli leaders cling to the delusion that there is no need for them to address political problems. Even if all blame for the latest fighting is assigned for the sake of argument to Hamas's corrupt, tyrannical and brutal government in Gaza, that does not change the fact that millions of Palestinians endure poverty and oppression as a consequence of Israel's policies. Failure to address these grievances obviously will continue to generate new kinds of national security threats for Israel. This will work to the benefit of Israel's adversaries in the region like Iran and Syria. But I want to come back finally to the lesson Pyrrhus taught us. King Pyrrhus eventually realized that even though he could win battles against the Romans, winning a battle didn't actually mean victory in any meaningful sense of the word. And that's even more true in our technological age. Perhaps the United States and other great powers will tomorrow discover a shield which can stop every conceivable incoming warhead. That, though, will only spur their adversaries to respond by creating greater numbers of warheads or to creating warheads that can penetrate those defenses. The history of war from the time of the Second World War on tells us that this constant cycle of competition means that any solution that guarantees security today will usually be short-lived. There is no such thing as permanent security. Wise nations come to agreements, treaties, and understandings which lead both of them not to commit extortionate resources to trying to bleed the other dry. Technology, don't get me wrong, can provide solutions to tactical military problems. It cannot and does not give guidance on how complex political problems should be solved. As the Nazis learned in the Second World War, the side with the better tech doesn't automatically win. The Nazi Fuhrer Adolf Hitler ranted and raved about these wonder weapons like the V1 and V2, which would obliterate his enemies. But having a V1 and a V2 could not solve the Third Reich's terrible infrastructural deficiencies, nor its inability to be able to compete with the United States' gargantuan industrial production resources. Karl von Clausewitz, the famous 19th century theoretician, taught us that the sinews of war, the muscles of war, are infinite cash. That's something for missile defense advocates to ponder over, especially if they belong to countries which don't have an endlessly replenishing pot of gold. I'm Praveen Swami, and I'm a contributing editor to The Print. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Explorer.